His name was not classified. It wasn't erased. It's on a wall in Washington, but almost no one remembers it. He was 19 years old, born in rural Georgia. He struggled in school, couldn't read beyond a 4th grade level. His IQ was measured at 68. He had never left his county. In 1967, the United States Army handed him a rifle. 3 months later, he was dead in Vietnam. He wasn't an exception. He was policy. And there were hundreds of thousands like him. In 1966, the Vietnam War had become something else. It wasn't strategy anymore. It was math. The war was consuming men faster than America could supply them. Monthly draft calls were increasing. Public support was collapsing. Protests were growing louder. But the Pentagon had a problem that couldn't be protested away. They needed bodies, and they were running out. For decades, the military had maintained minimum standards, cognitive thresholds, physical requirements. Men who scored too low on the Armed Forces qualification test were rejected. Below the 31st percentile, unfit. Roughly 1 million young men per year were turned away, labeled mentally inadequate, educationally deficient, unusable, until one man looked at that number and saw inventory. His name was Robert McNamara, and he believed war could be optimized. Robert McNamara was not a soldier. He was not a general. He was a systems analyst, a statistician, a man who believed numbers told the truth. He had helped transform Ford Motor Company using efficiency models and performance metrics, production lines, output ratios, cost optimization. Now, he was applying that same logic to war. Vietnam, to McNamara, was not chaos. It was data, troop strength, deployment cycles, casualty rates, replacement quotas. And when the numbers stopped aligning, he didn't see tragedy. He saw inefficiency. In October 1966, McNamara announced a new initiative, Project 100,000. The goal was simple: recruit 100,000 men per year who had previously been rejected. The public message was hopeful. This wasn't lowering standards, it was expanding opportunity. He called them New Standards Men. It sounded progressive, almost compassionate. But behind closed doors, the standards had been lowered. Men who had scored in the 10th percentile were now acceptable. Some scored lower. The safeguards that had existed since World War II were erased with a signature. There was no expanded training program, no specialized instruction, no extended preparation. They were fed into the same pipeline as everyone else. Basic training, deployment, Vietnam. McNamara called it rehabilitation. The military called it manpower. History would call it something else. They did not come from privilege. They came from the margins, rural poverty, urban neglect, special education classrooms, homes where books were rare and opportunity was rarer. Many were black, many were Hispanic, many were white men from Appalachian towns where the mines had closed and nothing replaced them. The average IQ hovered around 85. Some tested far below that. Reading levels ranged from 2nd grade to 5th. Some couldn't tell the time, some couldn't fill out basic forms, some had never held a steady job. In boot camp, drill instructors were given no warning. They discovered the reality when recruits couldn't follow simple instructions, couldn't memorize sequences, couldn't load weapons correctly under pressure. One sergeant later recalled a recruit who couldn't understand left from right. He tied a string around the man's right wrist. In combat, there would be no string. The system did not adjust. It absorbed them. Commanders were told to make it work, and the men kept coming. Between 1966 and 1971, more than 354,000 new standards men entered military service. Most went to the army, most went to Vietnam, most went to infantry. They were not told they were part of an experiment. They were told they were being given a chance. In Vietnam, there were no adjustments, no accommodations, no extra time. The jungle did not care about test scores. It cared about reaction speed, memory, coordination, clarity under fire. The margin for error was zero. A misread map meant walking into an ambush. A forgotten safety step meant an accidental detonation. A delayed reaction meant someone else died. Among the troops, a nickname began to circulate. Not in public briefings, not in official documents, in foxholes. They were called McNamara's morons. It was not said with cruelty. It was said with fear. Because these men were not just a risk to themselves, they were a risk to everyone around them. Friendly fire incidents increased, accidental detonations rose, platoons refused to take certain recruits on night patrols. Some units isolated them, assigned them simple tasks, kept them away from complex operations. But there were not enough simple tasks, and there were not enough men. So they went out anyway, and they died at higher rates than anyone else. Post-war studies showed the pattern. New standards then were significantly more likely to be killed in action, more likely to die in non-combat accidents. The difference was not enormous in percentage, but it was devastating in human terms. Thousands of additional graves. They did not lack courage, they lacked capacity, and the men who sent them knew it. The American public never heard the nickname. They heard something else. Opportunity, rehabilitation, a second chance. The Department of Defense produced promotional films, clean uniforms, smiling recruits, men learning trades, men gaining confidence. The narrator spoke about discipline, about growth, about patriotism. Civil rights leaders were invited to endorse the program. They were told it would lift poor communities, provide income, provide skills, break cycles of poverty. Some believed it. Some suspected the truth. Few spoke publicly against it. Because opposing military service during wartime was political suicide. Newspapers ran human interest stories, men who earned diplomas, men who came home with job training, men who found purpose. What they didn't run were the other stories, the men who came back with brain trauma, the men who couldn't adapt and were discharged quietly, the men who didn't come back at all. In speeches, McNamara used the language of social progress. He framed Project 100,000 as warfare against poverty. But in private memos, the language was different. Manpower shortages, quota fulfillment, acceptable loss rates. The word rehabilitation appeared often in public documents. It appeared rarely in internal ones. For the men who survived, the war did not end in Vietnam. It followed them home. Many returned with what we now call PTSD. But PTSD requires language, memory processing, the ability to articulate trauma. Some of these men did not have that ability. They experienced the symptoms without understanding them. Nightmares, flashbacks, rage, isolation. The VA system was not built for them. Therapy required explanation, paperwork required comprehension, benefits required navigation through bureaucracy. Some could not fill out the forms that determined their eligibility. Unemployment rates were significantly higher among Project 100,000 veterans. Homelessness followed the same pattern. Incarceration rates rose. Some turned to drugs, some turned violent, some simply disappeared back into the margins they had been pulled from. Their families received men they did not recognize. Men who had struggled before the war, men who were fractured after it. There was no specialized support, no public acknowledgement, no follow-up. The government had used them. And then it moved on. Robert McNamara left the Department of Defense in 1968. He became president of the World Bank. He lived a long life. He died in 2009 at the age of 93. In later interviews, he expressed regret about Vietnam. He admitted mistakes, strategic errors, miscalculations. In his memoir, Project 100,000 received a single paragraph. He called it a failure. He did not mention the death rates. He did not mention the men who came home broken. He did not mention the ones who never came home at all. Project 100,000 was quietly discontinued in 1971. There was no public investigation, no congressional reckoning, no formal apology, no reparations. The designation New Standards Men was buried in archives. For decades, the program remained obscure, footnoted in policy studies, briefly mentioned in military histories, largely absent from public memory. But the men were real. The graves were real. The consequences were permanent. The Vietnam War required sacrifice. 58,000 Americans died, millions of Vietnamese, entire generations scarred. But some sacrifices were chosen, and some were imposed. The men of Project 100,000 did not choose. They were told. They were being given opportunity. They were handed rifles they could barely operate, placed into a war they could barely comprehend, and killed at higher rates than standard recruits, not because they lacked courage, but because they lacked capacity. And the men who authorized the program understood the numbers. They saw the data. They approved it anyway. This was not an accident. It was policy, designed at the highest levels, implemented with efficiency, framed as compassion. There is a name on a wall in Washington, a grave in a small town no one visits anymore, a file in an archive few historians open. The IQ score is still written in the margins. The deployment date is stamped in ink. The death date comes soon after. He did not understand the war he was sent to fight. He did not understand the policy that sent him. He understood only this. He was told to serve. And he did. And there were hundreds of thousands like him.